How long can a man stay dead to his father before the dead father gets the last word? Mine waited until his own funeral. I'm the son they buried twice. Once when he stood up at the dinner table 7 years ago and said I wasn't his anymore, and again at the church door, where his second wife handed me a printed sheet that said the family had asked me not to speak and told the room I'd chosen to leave, so I didn't get to grieve. I sat in the back row. I didn't argue. I'd been to enough of these to know the part that matters doesn't happen at the podium. I just kept my eyes on the funeral director because 3 days earlier he'd called me, not them, and asked if I'd be there because Dad had left him standing instructions about a recording and a single sealed envelope to be played and opened only after the eulogy. They forgot the dead still get a turn. They forgot whose name was on the tape. I'll tell you the name the room heard at the end. For now, all you need to know is that the brother they called his only real son had no idea his own father had recorded who he actually was. The church was St. Anne's, in Millbrook, a town small enough that the woman selling lilies outside the chapel knew exactly which family I belonged to and exactly why I shouldn't have been there. She didn't say it. She just took my money for the flowers and let her eyes do the work. I'd bought white roses, a dozen, wrapped in brown paper, the cheap kind the florist ties with twine because she's run out of ribbon. I had driven 4 hours that morning to carry a dozen white roses to a man who hadn't spoken my name in 7 years, and I knew, even then, in the parking lot, with the engine still ticking, that I might not get to lay them down. I was right about that. I want to walk you through how I learned it, because the lesson came fast and it came at the door. Her name is Vivian. She married my father late. He was 61, she was 49, and the wedding photographs in his house had a way of cropping me out of the frame even when I'd been standing in it. She was waiting at the top of the chapel steps when I came up out of the lot with the roses in my arms. She had a folder. People who plan to win arguments at funerals always have a folder. She did not raise her voice. That was the thing about Vivian that took me years to understand. She never raised it, not once in 7 years, because she was never the one in the room who was afraid of losing. She thought she'd already won.
Daniel.
Just my name, flat, like a door closing.
I wasn't sure you'd come.
He's my father, I said. That's usually reason enough.
He was a lot of people's father in the end. He raised the boy who's about to speak. He buried the one who walked out. You can do the math on which one belongs at the front.
I didn't walk out, I said. He stood up from a dinner table and told me I wasn't his anymore. You were sitting at that table. You know the difference between leaving and being thrown out, Vivian. You were right there when it happened.
I opened nothing. Your father made his own decisions. He was a grown man.
He was a grown man who never once in 7 years returned a box with his own handwriting on it. Yours was the hand on everyone. I'd know it. I've seen enough of it.
If you came here to relitigate the last 7 years on the church steps, you came a long way for nothing. That's not the version anyone in there remembers, and today isn't the day to teach them a new one. I'm going to ask you to keep this quiet, for everyone's sake. You can sit. No one's going to drag you out of a church, but you understand you can't speak, and you can't go up front. The family discussed it.
Which family discussed it? I said.
There's only one. That was always your problem, Daniel. You thought leaving was the same as staying. You thought you could be gone for 7 years and still own a seat up front.
I don't want a seat up front, I said. I want to put flowers on my father's casket. That's it. That's the entire ambition I drove 4 hours with. Any son at any funeral in the history of the world gets to do that.
Grant has the flowers. It's handled.
Those aren't my flowers. I brought my own.
And that's exactly the kind of scene we're not going to have today. One arrangement at the casket, from the family, from the people who were actually here for him.
I wasn't here, I said, because I wasn't allowed to be here. You don't get to lock a man out of a house for 7 years and then point at the empty chair as proof he didn't care.
I'm not arguing with you. I'm telling you how today is going to go.
She slid a sheet of paper out of the folder and pressed it into my free hand, the hand that wasn't holding the roses. It was printed, typed, centered, in a serif font somebody had chosen to look official. At the family's request, Daniel Hale will not be speaking during today's service. My name in the middle of a sentence built to keep me out of it. She'd printed copies. I found that out later. She had a small stack, and she gave one to the reverend and one to the funeral director and kept the rest, the way you keep receipts. I looked at it. I looked at her. Did you type this yourself, I said, or did you have Grant do it?
Does it matter?
No, I said. It doesn't. I just want to know how many people sat around a table deciding I'm not allowed to say my own father's name out loud in a church. Was it a vote? Did it carry?
Nobody's stopping you from saying his name. We're stopping you from making today about you. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see it is the whole reason you're standing out here instead of sitting in there.
Today is about him, I said. I'm the only person on this porch who came 4 hours just to be near him with no plan to be seen doing it. You printed flyers. Grant brought the biggest spray the florist sells. Tell me again which one of us is making it about ourselves.
You can sit in the back. That offer expires the second you raise your voice. Take it or get in your car.
Behind her, a knot of relatives had gathered the way relatives do, half watching, ready to look away the second I looked at them. My Aunt Marion was among them, my father's older sister, a woman who had spent 7 years telling anyone who'd sit still that Daniel was bitter, that Daniel only ever cared about his share. She didn't look away fast enough. You've been telling people I only ever wanted his money, I said to her across the porch. 7 years of it. You still believe that, Marion? Standing here?
You broke that man's heart, Daniel. You can dress it up however you want. Standing here with your store-bought flowers. Some of us watched what it did to him.
Watched what it did to him, I said, from the inside of his house, while the boxes I sent were going out the front door faster than the mail could bring them. You watched something. I'll give you that.
Don't you stand on these steps and tell me what I watched.
I didn't answer her again. There's no answer to a person who watched a fire someone else set and decided you were the one holding the match. I just looked back at Vivian, who had used the interruption to compose her face into the expression she wanted the porch to see, patient, wounded, generous to a fault with a man who didn't deserve it. Then she turned to the small audience she'd assembled. She didn't need a microphone. The acoustics of a church door do the work for you.
He chose to leave us. He doesn't get to grieve us now that it's convenient. But I'm not going to be the one who turns a son away from his father's funeral. Sit in the back, Daniel. Be quiet. Let the people who loved him say goodbye to him.
There it was. The whole architecture of 7 years in one sentence, said calmly, to a porch full of people who wanted to believe it because believing it was easier than asking what actually happened at that dinner table. He chose to leave us. As if a man stands up at the head of his own family by choice. As if disownment is a door you walk out of rather than one that's slammed at your back. I'll tell you what I did. I'd love to tell you I had a line ready, something that cut her in half in front of God and the lilies. I didn't. I looked at her, and I looked at the printed sheet in my hand, and I looked at the roses, and I said the only thing that was true. I said I'd sit in the back.
Thank you. That's all I'm asking.
It was not all she was asking. People like Vivian never tell you the whole bill at the counter. But I didn't know the rest of it yet, so I carried my dozen roses down the side aisle, past pews full of people I'd grown up around, and I sat in the last row, on the end, where the cold comes off the stone wall. and I laid the roses face down across my knees, because a man who has been told he cannot bring flowers to the front does not sit there holding them up like an offering. He turns them over. He lets the paper crinkle and go quiet. He waits. I'd been in the seat about a minute when two women in the second pew leaned their heads together to do the thing people do at funerals, which is decide out loud who you are while pretending to whisper. One of them I half knew, a neighbor of the lake house, from before. She didn't lower her voice enough, or she didn't try to. "That's the one who robbed Walt blind," she said. "Come back to see what's left for him." The other clicked her tongue. "Some people have no shame." It was said the way you'd say it about a stranger 6 feet away who couldn't possibly hear, except I could, and a few heads turned to confirm the verdict and find my face, and I gave them my face so they could match it to the story. Vivian was 4 pews up, and a careful woman hears everything in a quiet church. She heard it. She let it stand. She didn't shush them, and she didn't turn. She just let the room finish writing me down the way she'd written me, 2 women doing the part of the sentence she'd left blank. That was when I understood that I hadn't been seated in the back. I'd been displayed there. If your stepmother stopped you at the church door and handed you a printed sheet saying the family had asked you not to speak at your own father's funeral, would you have argued or sat in the back row like I did? Let me tell you about the roses, because the flowers are going to matter, and I'd rather you understand the shape of it now than have me explain it later. For 7 years, my father sent my birthday gifts back. Every one. I want to be precise about this, because the count is the only part of it I ever got to keep straight. I would buy him something, nothing extravagant, a book he'd mentioned, a record he'd worn through the year I was a kid, a framed photo of the lake house from before everything, and I would wrap it, and I would mail it to the house in Millbrook, and 3 weeks later the post office would tell me it had been refused. Same box. Return to sender. In handwriting that wasn't his, the tape I'd put on it never broken, the bow I'd tied still tied. 7 of them, 7 years. I never once let a birthday pass without sending one, and not one of the 7 was ever opened by the man whose name was on the front. I never stopped either. Not because I thought one would land, because I'd learned the rhythm, and the rhythm was that I'd wrap a thing and send it anyway, every year, knowing the door would send my hand back bleeding and do it again the next year. 7 of them. I didn't skip a single one, and I didn't know until the day they buried him where any of them had really ended up. I should tell you about the dinner table, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on, and because the room at St. Anne's was full of people who thought they knew what happened at it and didn't. 7 years ago, there was a Sunday dinner, the kind we still did then, the whole assembled family of it. My father at the head, Vivian to his right, Grant across from me, Marion down the end pretending to carve. My father had something in front of him on the table that night. A folder. I didn't see what was in it. I only saw his face while he read it, and then I saw his face when he looked up at me. And the face was not a face I'd ever been on the wrong side of before. He stood up. He was not a man who stood up to speak. He was a sit-still, low-voice man, and he stood, and he said that he knew now what kind of son he'd raised, and that he was done, and that I should collect my coat. That was the entire speech. 11 words of verdict and 1 instruction about a coat. I asked him what was in the folder. He wouldn't say. Vivian sat very still and did not look surprised, and at the time I read her stillness as shock, the way you read a stranger's face at a funeral. I know now it wasn't shock. You don't look shocked at a play you've been rehearsing. But I'm getting ahead of the order, and the order matters in this story more than anything. So let me put that folder back down on the table for now and leave it closed, the way he left me closed out. What I'll say about my father, the living one, the one who could still refuse a box, is that he was not a cruel man by nature. That's what made the 7 years so strange to carry. A cruel man's rejection you can metabolize. You file the cruelty under his name and you move on. But my father had taught me to drive in the same truck he later told me to take my coat and leave in. He had stood in the cold at 100 of my games. He had a laugh you could hear from the dock when the fish weren't biting. The man who sent the boxes back was wearing that man's handwriting on the label, or near enough, and that's the part that doesn't scab over. It wasn't a stranger turning me away. It was him, somehow convinced of something and refusing to tell me what year after returned year. So when I tell you I bought roses that morning, understand what I was doing. I was knocking one more time at the only door he had left, the lid of a casket, where a man can't refuse a flower because a man can't do anything anymore. And his wife had met me at the threshold with a typed sheet to send that back too. The service hadn't started. People were still filing in, finding seats, doing the soft funeral choreography of who sits where. I had time to look around. I want to introduce you to the room, because every person in it is going to do something before the day is over, and most of them don't know it yet. Up front in the first pew, the place reserved for the closest blood, sat Grant. Grant Mercer. Mercer, not Hale, his mother's name from before, the one she'd kept when she married my father. Nobody in that family ever thought twice about it, least of all me. For now, Grant, 34, broad through the shoulders, a good suit, the kind of man who looks like he belongs at the front of any room he walks into and has spent his life making sure he does. Vivian's son from before she married my father. My stepbrother, if you want to call him that. He'd called my father Dad for 10 years. He was holding the biggest arrangement in the church on his lap. White calla lilies, a spray of them, the florist's premium tier, the kind that comes with its own little easel, and he held it the way you hold something you intend to be seen holding. He'd been the favorite for as long as there was a contest. That's not bitterness. That's just the weather report. When you're the son who left and there's a son who stayed, the math does itself, and Grant had stayed, and Grant had said the right things at the right dinners, and Grant had been there in the last year when I had not, because I had not been allowed to be. I want to be fair to the version of events that the room believed, because the room believed it hard, and the room wasn't entirely wrong about the surface of it. Grant stayed. I left. From the back pew, that's the only sentence that's visible. 2 rows behind Grant, off to the side, sat a young woman I almost didn't recognize. Nora, Vivian's daughter, Grant's sister, my stepsister, though I'd met her maybe 4 times in my life, and the last of those was before the dinner table. She'd been a teenager then. She was a grown woman now, with a couple of kids of her own, I'd heard somewhere. She wasn't sitting with her mother. I noticed that, and filed it away without knowing why it mattered. She had a paper shopping bag at her feet, the handles knotted, and she kept one foot pressed against it the whole service, the way you guard a thing you've carried a long way. I didn't know what was in the bag. I'll tell you, but not yet. Some things you have to earn by sitting in the back row long enough. When the procession was forming and people were still moving, she got up to find the restroom, and her path took her down my aisle, and for half a second she stopped level with me, close enough to speak under the organ.
You came.
I did, I said. Is that a problem?
No, it's the opposite of a problem. He'd have wanted you here.
I got a different impression at the door, I said. Your mother handed me a printed sheet. The family asked me not to speak, apparently.
My mother isn't the whole family. Whatever she said to you out there, she doesn't speak for all of us. She never did. She just talks the loudest, so people think she does.
Who do you speak for, then?
Myself. And maybe him a little. I spent more time with him this last year than anybody wants to admit. She looked at the bag by her seat, then back at me, and she said something I didn't understand until much later. I've been keeping something for you for a long time. 7 years, almost. After this is over, don't leave too fast. That's all I'm going to say in here.
She started to add something to it. I saw it come up in her. Her mouth opened on a word. Her eyes went once to the front pew where her mother sat, and whatever it was went back down her throat unsaid. She'd been carrying it long enough to know exactly how heavy it was and exactly how much a wrong second would cost. I'm not brave, she said finally, like a correction to something I hadn't accused her of. I want you to know that going in. I've been the quiet one in that house my whole life. I'm working up to something and I might not get there. Then she pressed her foot a little harder against the bag. The way you steady yourself. Not a thing. I asked her what it was.
Not here. Not with her sitting 20 feet away. Just, when it's done, find me. Don't get in your car and drive off the way you've been planning to since the door. Promise me that much.
I told her I'd think about it. It was the most honest thing I could offer a stranger I shared a stepmother with. And she went. I sat there turning that over. I've been keeping something for you. And I had no idea what it meant. And I'd be lying if I said I let myself hope. I'd spent 7 years being right about how little to expect from that family, and being right that often teaches a man to keep his hands in his pockets. Up near the front, off to the side of the altar, in a dark suit that fit him the way suits fit men who wear them every working day of their lives, stood the funeral director, Arthur Boyd. Boyd and Sons, the home that had handled half the burials in Millbrook for 40 years. My father had known him a long time. They'd fished the same lake, sat on the same parish committee, argued about the same town politics over the same bad coffee. Boyd had a body language I didn't have a word for at the time. He was calm the way a man is calm when he's holding something the rest of the room doesn't know about. Every so often, his eyes went to a small table near the altar rail, where there was a thing under a folded cloth. And then his eyes came back to the room, and then, once, his eyes found me, all the way in the back, and held for a second, and then let go. That look is the reason I'm telling you this story instead of telling you about the 4-hour drive home from a funeral where nothing happened. 3 days before, my phone had rung with a Millbrook area code I didn't recognize. I nearly thumbed it to voicemail and went back to the dishes. Something made me answer.
Mr. Hale, Daniel Hale.
I said yes, and I waited for it to be a robocall.
This is Arthur Boyd, with Boyd and Sons in Millbrook. I'm handling the arrangements for your father. I wanted to confirm with you directly that you've been told the service is Thursday, 11 o'clock, at St. Anne's.
I told him no one had told me anything.
No one called you?
I told him no. I told him I'd found out my father had died from a cousin's post online, the way you find out about weather in a town you used to live in. I didn't say it bitter. I'd run out of bitter somewhere around year 4. I just said it.
I see. Then I'm glad I called. Your father gave me your number, Daniel, some time ago. He gave me instructions, and your number was part of them, and the instructions were specific that I was to make sure you in particular knew the time and the place.
Say that again, I said.
He gave me your number himself. He said of everyone, make sure Daniel knows when and where. He was specific. Not the household, you. I've made one phone call about Thursday, Daniel, and it's this one.
He gave you my number, I said. When?
Months ago. He came in to make arrangements before he needed to. People do that more than you'd think. They get their affairs in order while they still have the hands to do it. He had a folded slip of paper with your number on it, and he watched me copy it into the file myself. He wanted to be sure I had it right.
And he didn't give you anyone else's? Not his wife's?
He gave me the household's contact for the logistics, the obituary, the flowers, the catering after. But the instruction to call a person and confirm their attendance, in those words, that was about you. Only you.
I want you to understand what that did to me, standing in my kitchen 400 miles away with the phone against my ear. My father had not said my name in 7 years. He had sent back every box. And here was a man telling me that somewhere in the planning of his own death, my father had written my phone number down and instructed a stranger to make sure I, specifically, was in that church. Not the wife who'd shared his bed, not the son who'd stayed. Me, the one he'd buried at a dinner table. I asked Boyd why, what instructions, why me?
I'm not able to go into it on the phone, and I'd be doing your father a disservice to try. He left a standing instruction with me. There's a recording, and there's a sealed envelope, and the instruction is that both are to wait until after the eulogy, not before. After.
What's on the recording? I said.
I haven't listened to it. That wasn't my job, and I wouldn't have if it had been. He handed me a sealed package and a written instruction, and he made me promise the order of it, and the order is the only thing I'm certain of.
But you know it's a recording. You know there's an envelope.
He told me that much because I had to know what I was holding and when to produce it. A recording to be played for the room, a sealed envelope to be opened and read aloud, both after the eulogy. I don't know what's on the one or in the other. That's the truth, Daniel, and I've found over 40 years it's the only thing worth saying at a funeral. He didn't explain it to me. He just made me promise.
Does Vivian know about this? I said. About the recording, the envelope, any of it? Boyd was quiet for a second, and in the quiet I heard the answer before he gave it.
Your father's instruction was that I administer it myself, regardless of what the family asked for. He used that word. Regardless. He said it twice, so I'd write it down twice. I think you can read into that, whatever you've earned the right to read into it.
So she doesn't know.
She knows there's a funeral. She knows I'm running it. What she doesn't know is that I'm not running it for her. I'm running it for the man who paid me to keep an order he made me promise to keep. Those are different jobs. Most days they look the same. Thursday they won't.
And what am I supposed to do with that? I said.
Nothing. You don't do anything. You come, and you sit, and you let me do the thing your father asked me to do. That's the whole of your part in it. He didn't ask you to fight anyone. He asked me to make sure you were in the room.
Why are you doing this? I said. You don't owe me anything. You barely know me. You could play the tape or not play it, and either way you collect your fee and the family writes you a card. Why call the one person nobody wanted called?
Because he asked me to, and because he was my friend before he was my client. We fished that lake 30 years. And because in 40 years of this work I've buried a lot of men who left things unsaid, and your father is the rare one who said it, on his own time, with his own voice, and made me the keeper of it. I don't take that lightly. He trusted me with the order. The least I can do is make sure the one person it was meant for is in the building to hear it.
I asked him if he was sure it was meant for me.
I'm sure he called you the one name. I'm sure he made me promise the order. The rest you'll hear when the room hears it. I won't pretend to know more than I do.
Then he said one more thing, and it's the thing I drove 4 hours on.
Be there, Daniel. Whatever they do at the door, and I suspect they'll do something, be in that room when I reach for it. Don't let her words at the threshold drive you back to your car before the man in the box gets his turn. That's all I ask. Sit through whatever they put you through, and stay until it's done.
I told him I'd be there. It was the easiest promise I'd made in 7 years, and the hardest one to keep, because keeping it meant sitting in a back pew while a woman with a folder told a room I'd chosen to abandon a man I'd driven 4 hours to bury. So that's what the look meant, from the front of the church, when his eyes found me in the back row with a dozen roses face down on my knees. It meant, you came. It meant, I have the thing. It meant, wait. I'm not going to tell you what was on the recording. I don't get to, and neither do you, not yet. That's not me being coy. That's me keeping faith with the order my father set, the order Boyd promised, the order that the whole day turned on. After the eulogy, not before. I sat in that pew for the length of an entire service not knowing what my own father had recorded, and you're going to sit here with me because that's the only honest way to tell it. The not knowing was the worst part and the truest part. If I'd known, I'd have spent the service watching the clock. Not knowing, I spent it watching the people. and watching the people is how you learn what a funeral is actually for. What I knew at that point, all I knew, was the shape of it. My father, who had cut me out of his life 7 years ago and sent back 7 Christmases and 7 birthdays of unopened proof, had spent some part of his last days arranging for a stranger to put a recording and a sealed envelope in front of a room that didn't want me in it. He had reached past his wife. He had reached past the son who stayed. He had reached all the way to the back row, to me, and the only message I'd received so far was, "Be there." I didn't know if it was an apology or a verdict. I didn't know if my name was on it or someone else's. I knew the order, after the eulogy, and I knew the man holding it. And I knew that whatever it was, Vivian had built a printed sheet and a porch speech and 7 years of a story to make sure it never got the chance to be heard. She'd handed me paper at the door to keep me quiet. She hadn't counted on the dead man's paper. There was a second piece of paper in that church, in a sealed envelope on a small table under a folded cloth, and it had been waiting longer than hers. I couldn't make the two sides of it balance. 7 years of being erased on one side, a dead man's instruction that I be in the room on the other, and I'd stopped trying somewhere on the second hour of the drive. I just came, the way Boyd asked, and sat where I was told, and held the flowers I wasn't allowed to lay down, and waited for a eulogy I wasn't allowed to give to end so a stranger could keep a promise to my father. The organ started. That low first chord that tells a room to settle, the one that does something to your spine no matter how many of these you've sat through. People stopped rustling. Vivian took her seat in the front pew beside Grant, the two of them framed exactly the way the cropped photographs had always framed them. Mother and son, the real family. The ones with the right to the front. Grant set the calla lilies upright on the floor beside him, against the pew, where everyone could see what he'd brought. I turned my roses another quarter-turn face down on my knees and felt the paper give. The Reverend came out. He had the printed sheet, too. I watched him glance down at the order of service, and I knew, because Vivian had handed him one of her copies at the door, that somewhere on his clipboard was a line about a son who would not be speaking. The Reverend was a kind enough man with no spine for a fight, and he did what kind men with no spine do at funerals. He followed the program he was handed. He welcomed everyone. He said the things you say. He said my father was a good man, a devoted husband, a father. And there he paused, just slightly, the pause of a man counting heads and not sure of the number. And then he went on, a devoted father, singular in a way that everyone in the front 3 pews understood and I understood from the back. He invited the family to share their words, and he looked, the way they always look, to the front pew, where the right son was sitting with his lilies ready. Grant stood. He buttoned his jacket. He had the walk of a man who'd practiced the walk, and as he came up the side toward the lectern, he passed within a few feet of me, close enough that I could have touched his sleeve. And he did not look at me. Not a flicker. To Grant, the back row was empty. I was furniture. I was a coat someone had left. He reached the lectern. He set down a single index card he would not need, because Grant had this part memorized. Grant had probably had this part memorized for years, the way some people rehearse the toast before they've met the bride. He looked out over the room, over his mother, over the casket, over all the heads that turned up toward him like flowers toward the one light they'd been told to follow. And from the back, with my roses face down and the cold stone against my shoulder, and Arthur Boyd standing off to the side of the altar, with his eyes already moving toward a small table under a folded cloth. I watched the favorite son open his mouth to bury our father, and I waited to hear him call himself the only real one. I'll tell you what he said. But first you should know what I was holding in my hands while he said it, because the two things belong together. I was holding a dozen white roses I had been forbidden to lay down, wrapped in brown paper and cheap twine, turned face down on my knees so the room wouldn't see a disowned man trying to grieve. And up at the front, propped against the first pew where he could keep one hand on it, My stepbrother had the biggest arrangement in the church. Same flowers almost. White, both of us. Opposite hands. One bunch barred from the casket, one bunch on its way. That was the part of the day I'd come prepared for. 7 years had taught me the shape of it. The favorite up front with the flowers, the disowned one in the back with his face down, the story already written and read into the room before I ever crossed the threshold. I knew that part. I'd braced for that part the whole 4-hour drive. What I had not braced for, what nobody in that church had braced for, not the widow in the front pew who thought she'd already won, not the favorite son buttoning his jacket at the lectern, not even me with a stranger's promise warm in my pocket, was that the quietest man in the building was the dead one, and that he had left himself a voice. And neither of us, not me in the back, not Grant at the lectern, not Vivian with her folder of printed sheets, knew that the man in the box had recorded something, and that Arthur Boyd had already begun, very quietly, with his eyes on a small table near the altar rail, to move toward the folded cloth. The back row of St. Anne's is where you sit when you are not allowed to be anything. Not a son, not a brother, not even a man with a name they'll say out loud. I sat there with the flowers face down on my lap, the way she'd handed them back to me at the door, stems toward my knees, blossoms hidden, like even the flowers were something I should be ashamed of carrying. People filed past. Some of them I'd known since I was a boy. Not one of them stopped. Vivian had built the seating like a woman who builds everything. She'd sat the front 2 pews with her own people, her sister, the women from her bridge afternoons, the cousins who'd arrived in the last 7 years and called my father Walt, like they'd earned it. She put Grant at the aisle end of the first pew, where the light from the tall window landed on him. She'd put a reserved card on the seat beside him. I read it twice from the back. It said Grant, family. There was no card with my name on it anywhere in that building, and I had checked. Boyd's number, 3 days back, not the house line. I've told you that part. The phone call is why I was in the building at all, and I'm not going to walk you through it again. What it bought me was a seat with a sight line, and a man against the wall who'd promised a dead friend he'd keep an order no widow could touch. There he was now, along the side wall of the chapel, in a gray suit, hands folded, a small black recorder on the table beside the guest book, and a single sealed envelope under his left hand that he did not move and did not explain. He looked at me once when I walked in. He gave me the smallest nod a man can give and still mean it. Then he looked away, because Vivian was watching, and Boyd was a careful man. The funeral director called me 3 days before, and he never called the widow. Would you have told her he'd called you, or kept your eyes forward and said nothing? I kept my eyes forward. I'd learned the hard way, over 7 years, that the only weapon nobody can take off you at a door is the one I had left. I knew how to sit still and let other people talk themselves into the daylight. Here is what I want you to hold on to, because I knew this much and no more walking in. In the last year of his life, my father had gone to see Boyd and left him a recording with a date on it and a single sealed envelope, both to be handled only after the eulogy. And he'd arranged for his own lawyer to sit in the room and swear they were real. That's all I had. I didn't know what the recording said. I didn't know what the envelope held. I knew my father had sat in a chair and decided he'd gotten one thing wrong. I let myself believe the one thing was me. I let myself believe he'd recorded an apology to a son he'd wrongly cut off, and that I'd sit in the back and hear him say my name kindly once, and then drive home and keep it. I was wrong about how big the wrong was, but I'm getting ahead of the room. Boyd had been plain about one thing on the phone, and I want you holding it the way I held it through every minute of that service. Not before the eulogy, not a word of it, no matter who in that room asked him to start early or stop. After. So I sat there with a clock running that had no hands on it. A thing was going to happen, and it was going to happen in a fixed place in the morning, after a man I despised finished talking, and I had no way to make it come faster, and Vivian had no way to make it not come. That's the strange arithmetic of a back pew. Everyone in the front thought the loud part of the day was the eulogy. I knew the loud part was scheduled for after it. I just didn't know what it would say. And there was one small thing I noticed and filed and did not understand. The way you notice a hairline in a wall you'll later watch a house come down through. Twice during the early part of the service, Grant's eyes went to the little side table near the altar rail, the one with the guest book and the folded cloth, and under Boyd's hand, the recorder he hadn't looked at twice. Grant didn't know what was on that table. I'd swear to it now. But something in him kept checking it, the way an animal checks a corner of a field it can't see into. I didn't make anything of it then. I'm only telling you because he checked it, and because of what was sitting there, and I'll let you sit with the two facts side by side the way I had to. I'd seen Boyd once before the morning of the funeral. The evening before, there was a viewing at the funeral home, 2 hours, 6 to 8, open to anyone. I drove in at 7:45, when the line would be thin and Vivian's people would be tired. I was right about the thinning. I was wrong about being unnoticed. Vivian was at the door of the viewing room like she'd be at the door of the church, and she stepped into the frame of it when she saw me coming down the hall.
We're closing in 10 minutes.
Then I'll take 5, I said.
Daniel, I'm asking you not to do this. Pay your respects tomorrow if you have to, from the back, quietly. Tonight is for the people who were in his life.
Who's that? I said. Who exactly was in his life this last year?
I was. Grant was. The people who didn't make him sit up at night, wondering where he went wrong with his own son. You want to come stand over him now and feel something? You had 7 years to feel something. You sent it back in a box.
I almost said the boxes came back to me, not from me. I didn't. You don't hand a careful person the shape of what you know. I just stood there and let the silence get long enough to be hers to break. And she broke it, because people who control rooms can't stand a silence they didn't plan.
5 minutes. Then you go. And tomorrow you do not stand up. You do not speak, and you do not bring anything up to that casket. Are we clear?
We're clear, I said. I won't stand up, I won't speak, I won't bring anything up to the casket. I'll take my 5 minutes and I'll go, and tomorrow I'll sit wherever you've decided a son like me belongs. It was true. We were very clear. I went into the room and Boyd was at the side of it the way he'd be at the side of the church, in the same gray suit. And he let Vivian watch him do absolutely nothing for me. He didn't approach. He didn't speak across the room. He waited until she'd turned to deal with a cousin, and then he was beside me at the casket, low, fast, the voice of a man who has timed a sentence to fit inside a gap.
There's something I didn't say on the phone, because the phone wasn't the place. He didn't just leave me a recording. He dated it, said the date out loud on the tape, in his own voice, so no one could ever stand up and claim it was made when he wasn't himself, and he didn't leave me to do it alone. His own lawyer drew the instruction and witnessed it. Ruth Calloway. She'll be in the church tomorrow, second pew on the left, where she doesn't belong as a guest and belongs exactly as a witness. She'll have her own piece of it. Whatever your stepmother does at that door tomorrow, there will be 2 of us in the room your father chose, and not one of us answers to her.
Why a stranger? I said, low as his. Why a tape and a lawyer in a pew instead of a phone call while he was alive?
I asked him a version of that myself. He said a phone call could be denied. He said a son could be told it never happened, and a widow could swear to a room it never did. He said he wanted it somewhere. It couldn't be edited and couldn't be lost and couldn't be explained away by anyone standing over his casket. so he built it where she couldn't reach it. Go home, Daniel. Get some sleep. Be in that back row tomorrow where I can see you, and let Calloway and me carry the rest.
There was one more thing at the viewing, and I almost missed it, because I was watching Boyd move away and Vivian come back. A young woman caught my sleeve at the end of the casket. 23, maybe. Dark hair pinned up, a plain black dress, eyes that didn't go with the rest of the room because they weren't performing anything. It took me a second. The last time I'd seen her, she'd been a girl of 16 at the far end of that Sunday table, the one who'd stared at her plate the whole time the folder was doing its work. Nora, Vivian's daughter, my stepsister, if the word means anything, which in that family it didn't.
Daniel.
I said her name back. I hadn't said it out loud in 7 years.
You shouldn't be here. She'll make a thing of it.
I told her I knew. I told her I was leaving in a minute.
No, I don't mean don't come. I mean be careful. Tomorrow. She's got it all arranged, the front pews, the eulogy, the flowers, who stands where. She's been arranging it for a week. Whatever you think is going to happen tomorrow, she thinks she's already decided how it ends.
What does that mean? I said. Already decided how it ends. You're telling me to be careful at a funeral. Careful of what? Do you know something I don't? She looked over her shoulder at her mother, who was still turned away with the cousin, and something passed over her face. Not fear exactly, more like a person standing at the edge of a thing she's been wanting to step off for years and hasn't worked out how.
I know my mother. That's all I know. I know what she's capable of arranging. A pause. I've kept some things, Daniel. For a long time, I don't. This isn't the place. Just be in the church tomorrow. Sit where the man in the gray suit can see you. Will you do that?
The man in the gray suit already told me that, I said. Word for word, nearly. Sit where I can see you. Now you're saying it too. Is there a reason the two of you keep telling a man where to sit at his own father's funeral?
Then maybe somebody in this family besides me has a spine after all. Go home. Don't let her catch us talking.
And she was gone, back into the thin crowd, before I could ask what things she'd kept, or why a girl who'd been 16 at that table was telling a disowned man to be careful at his own father's funeral. I drove home with one more loose thread than I'd come with, and no idea it tied to the boxes in my own closet, and no idea it would be her hand that walked me up to that casket the next day. But I keep getting ahead of the room, so let me bring it back. So now you know what I knew, which was almost nothing, and almost everything. In the last year of his life, my father, full of regret over something, had recorded a statement and dated it on the tape, and sealed an envelope, and put both into the hands of a man whose whole trade was not opening things early, with his own lawyer set to swear the two were genuine. I didn't know what the recording said. I didn't know what the envelope held. I let myself believe the regret was about me, that I'd finally hear him say my name and mean it kindly once, in front of everyone who'd buried me with him. I was right that it was about me. I had no idea how much of it was about somebody else. Vivian found me again the morning of the funeral before the service started. She came down the side aisle in charcoal gray pearls, her hair set the way it was set for church every Sunday of the 7 years I wasn't welcome at one. She didn't sit. She stood at the end of my pew the way a teacher stands at a desk, and she looked at the flowers face down on my lap before she looked at my face.
You came.
I said I did.
I gave you the sheet at the door, so there wouldn't be a scene. I'd appreciate it if you honored it. The Reverend has the order of service. There's no place in it for you.
I told her I wasn't planning to speak.
Good. Because if you stand up, Daniel, I will have you walked out, and these people will watch it happen, and they'll remember that picture of you longer than they'll remember him.
I asked her what picture she thought they were keeping of me now.
The one you earned. The boy who took from his father and then cried that he'd been cut off. You did this to yourself. He told you to leave. I only ever did what he asked.
You were at that table 7 years ago, I said. You sat there the whole night and you never said one word.
Because it wasn't my place. A wife doesn't get between a man and his son. I sat there, and I let your father do the hardest thing he ever did, and I held his hand afterward when he couldn't sleep. That's what I did. I'd do it again.
I told her I never signed his name to anything.
Then you can take that up with him, can't you? Oh, that's right. She let that sit half a second. You can't.
That was the cold in her. Not a raised voice, not a flush in the face. A widow in pearls, reminding a son that the only man who could clear him was in the box at the front of the room. I asked her, because I wanted to hear what she'd say, whether the flowers were a problem too.
The casket arrangements are family. Grant chose them. It would look strange for you to add to them. People would ask why you're here at all. And frankly, Daniel, so do I.
They're white roses, I said. 12 of them. I bought them this morning from the woman selling flowers outside the chapel before I came up the steps. I drove 400 miles with them on the passenger seat so they wouldn't tip over. That's all they are.
Then keep them. Take them home. Press one in a book if it helps you. But they are not going on that casket, because that casket belongs to the people he chose to keep, and you are not on that list. He took your name off it himself. I watched him do it.
Did you watch him do it? I said, or did you help him do it?
Careful. You're a guest here on my goodwill, and my goodwill is the only reason you're not already in the parking lot. Don't make me regret the manners.
I'm not a guest, I said. I'm his son.
His son. She said it like she was testing the weight of a coin she suspected was counterfeit. Sons don't get returned to sender. Sons get answered. You stopped existing in that house. The day he stood up at that table, and the only person who keeps insisting otherwise is you, sitting in a back row with a fistful of flowers he won't be able to smell. Let it go, Daniel. For 1 hour, let the man be buried by the family he wanted.
That was the second cruelty, and it was colder than the first, because it was dressed as mercy. The first was the folder, 7 years gone. The second was here, now in pearls, telling a man the flowers he'd carried 400 miles weren't fit to lie over his own father, and calling it a kindness, and meaning it as a kindness, because in her arithmetic, erasing me cleanly was the most humane way to keep her column from ever being audited. I told her I was here because my father's funeral director called me. Something moved behind her face when I said it. Quick, gone. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't ask why Boyd would call me. A woman who's afraid of a question doesn't ask it. She walks away from it. She straightened the cuff of her sleeve, glanced once more at the blossoms hidden against my knees, and that thing moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile.
Stay in your seat, for his sake, if not your own.
Then she turned and walked back up the aisle to the front pew, to the seat with the card that had a name on it. I turned the flowers a little on my lap, so the stems stopped digging into my palm. That was the whole adjustment I allowed myself. A man in the back row turning his flowers over so they'd stop hurting his hand. When somebody has spent 7 years selling a room, the story that you're the villain and you finally stand in that room, do you fight to correct the record in front of all of them, or do you go quiet and let them keep believing it a little longer? I'll tell you what fighting would have bought me. It would have bought her the scene she wanted, and it would have handed the room the story they'd already been sold. So I sat, and I waited for a dead man and a recorder I wasn't allowed to touch. To understand why I sat instead of stood, you have to understand how the leaving happened, because the leaving is the wound, and the wound is the reason none of these people would look at me. So let me take you back 7 years, to the dinner where my father stood up. It was a Sunday. My father set a Sunday table the way some men set a clock, Same hour, same chair, same grace before anyone touched a fork. I had a key to that house then. I'd grown up in it. The summer I turned 16, we reshingled the back porch together over 4 weekends, and there's a board near the door that still has my initials scratched into the underside where he couldn't see them, and on good days I think he knew they were there and left them. That Sunday there was a folder on the table where the bread usually went. Manila, the corner bent. I remember the bent corner because I stared at it through the whole thing, the way you stare at one small object when the large one is too much to look at. My father didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table with one hand flat on the folder, and he said the words I have replayed more times than any words a man should have to carry. I'm not going to give you the whole of it. Some of it is mine. But the shape was this. He believed I'd taken money from him, not borrowed, taken. He believed I'd gone behind him to a man he did business with and moved money that wasn't mine to move, and signed his name where my name had no business being. He had paper that said so. He lifted the folder an inch off the table like the weight of it was the proof. He said he had it right there in his hand, and asked me not to make him read it out at his own table. I don't know what's in that folder, I told him. I've never seen it. He told me what was in it without opening it. My name and his on the same page, he said. A number that had left his account and never come back. A signature that was supposed to be his and wasn't, and a second one that was supposed to be mine, and a man at the bank who'd said a Hale walked it through. And there were only 2 Hales it could be, and one of them was him. He asked me, flat, if I was telling him the paper was lying. Yes, I said. I'm telling you the paper is lying or somebody made it. Who brought it to you? Where did it come from? Because it didn't come from anything I ever did. It came to him, he said, as if that settled it, and he asked whether it mattered how a true thing arrives. It matters more than anything else in that folder, I said. Read it out. Every line, in front of everyone at this table. Whatever's in there, I didn't do it, and I'd rather be accused to my face than to a bent corner of cardboard. He said he wasn't going to humiliate me in front of the family. You're humiliating me right now, I said. The humiliation is you standing and me sitting and you holding the one page that's supposed to damn me and refusing to let me touch it. Put it in my hands. Let me show you where it's wrong. And what if I couldn't show him? He asked. What if it was exactly what it looked like? What was he supposed to do then? He said, with his own son at his table. I told him then he'd know for certain, and we could fix it together the way we fixed the porch. He looked at the folder. For 1 second his hand loosened on it, and I have spent 7 years inside that 1 second, because I think if he'd opened it and read it out, somebody at that table would have had to say something, and the somebody wouldn't have been me. But he didn't open it. He pressed his hand flat again, and then he said the thing I couldn't fight, that a man who'd done nothing wrong wouldn't be this calm. I have thought about that sentence every day since, because it was the one thing I couldn't fight. The calmer I stayed, the guiltier I looked, the more I tried to explain, the more I sounded like a man with a story. He'd already decided. The folder had decided for him before I walked in the door, and the folder I would learn much too late had been set on that table by a hand that wasn't his. Vivian was at that table. 3 years married to him by then. She didn't say a word during any of it. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes down, the picture of a woman who didn't want to come between a father and his son. I used to think that was decency. I understand it differently now. A person who has lit a fire doesn't need to fan it. They only have to sit very still and let it take the room. Grant was there too. 27 then, living in the house. Between things the way he'd always been between things. He was the one who walked me to the door when it was over. For 1 stupid second I thought he was going to say something on my side. He put his hand on my shoulder in the front hall, under the light my father had wired himself.
You should go before it gets ugly, Daniel, for your own sake.
Do you believe it? I said. The thing in that folder. You were across the table. You watched him read it. Do you actually believe I'd steal from him?
It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what he believes, and he's not going to unbelieve it tonight. Go home. Let it cool.
That's not an answer, I said. I asked you a straight question in your own front hall. Yes or no? Do you think I did it?
I think you should be in your car. That's what I think. The longer you stand here making me pick a side, the worse it goes for you.
Then do one thing for me, I said. When it cools, and you just told me it'll cool, you tell him I never touched $1 of his. You were standing here. You heard me say it. Tell him that.
Sure, when it cools.
For your own sake. When it cools. I didn't hear the warning under the words then. I heard a brother. I still called him that, trying to spare me. It took me years to hear it the other way. A man closing a door he'd helped build and telling the person on the wrong side of it that the closing was a kindness. It never cooled. He never told him. I know that now because I know who kept it hot. I left. I didn't take a check. I didn't take a key. I set mine on the hall table on my way out, next to the bowl that had held my father's spare change since I was 9, and I closed the door behind me with my own hand, so no one could ever say I'd slammed it. I drove home. By the next morning, the story was already moving because Vivian had spent 3 years building the kind of room where a story moves fast and the truth has to walk. You should know how that story sounded, because the people in those front pews were the people it had been sold to. My Aunt Marion carried it, my father's sister. She'd never warmed to me, and Vivian had given her something to do with that. By the end of the first month, the version going around the family was clean and complete. Daniel stole from Walt. Daniel forged Walt's name. Daniel got caught, and now Daniel's bitter. Bitter, that was the word that stuck. Because being caught had cost him his place in the will. Only sorry about the inheritance. I heard it come back to me through a cousin who thought he was doing me a favor by warning me what people were saying. For 7 years I was the man who stole from his own father and was only sorry he'd lost the money. I never stole $1. There was nothing to be sorry about losing because I had never wanted it. But you cannot prove a negative to people who've enjoyed believing the positive. So I stopped trying. I moved a state away. I built a small life with a door that locked and a phone that mostly didn't ring, and twice a year, his birthday in March, mine in October, I'd think about picking it up, and I wouldn't. Except for the gifts. Here is the thing I have not told anyone until now. Every year on his birthday, I sent my father a present. Small things. The first year, a book about a river he used to fish before I was born, a place he talked about the way other men talk about a woman they didn't marry. The years after, more of the same, a record, a photograph, things that cost nothing and meant the only thing I had left to say. I wrapped them myself. I wrote his name on the card in the Front-Hall Handwriting he taught me. And every year, inside a week, the package came back. Unopened. Returned to sender across the middle in a hand I didn't recognize. The tape never broken. The bow I'd tied, still tied. I never stopped. A man can mail his heart to a closed door more times than you'd think, if the door is the only one his father has left. 7 of them, one for every year, everyone wrapped in the same care and sent the same way and marked return to sender. In that hand I didn't recognize. The tape never broken. The bow I'd tied, still tied. I told myself every March that one came back, that my father was reading the name on the front and refusing it, that the rejection had his eyes on it even if it didn't have his pen. That was the part I carried. Not a closet of boxes. I didn't get to keep the boxes, just the knowledge that 7 times I'd reached and 7 times something had pushed my hand back. 7 years of returned birthday gifts, never opened, sent back in the same boxes. I didn't know. Sitting in that pew with the flowers turned over on my lap, I had no way to know, that the boxes hadn't gone to a landfill the way I'd been led to believe and hadn't been refused by my father's hand at all. That all 7 of them were 100 feet from me right then, kept by the one person in that family who never sold the story, soft-cornered and saved in a closet that wasn't mine. I'd learned that at the casket. but I'm still getting ahead of the room. What I knew, sitting in the back of St. Anne's, was the shape of the wound and nothing about the cure. I knew my father had cut me off over a folder. I knew the folder had paper in it with his name and mine on the same page. I knew Boyd was against the wall with a recorder and an envelope and 30 years of loyalty to a dead man, waiting for a eulogy to end. And I knew Vivian had spent the morning making sure 200 people understood which son was the real one before anyone had spoken a word. She made sure of it twice, in fact, because she wasn't finished with me at the pew. The Reverend began his opening, the standing, the prayer, the first hymn that half the room mumbled because they didn't know it, and the other half sang too loud because they did. I stayed on my feet for the hymn out of habit, flowers in one hand now. Vivian must have counted the room from the front, the way she counted everything, because when the hymn ended and the Reverend gestured for everyone to sit, my aunt rose from the second pew and came down the side aisle to where I stood. She did Vivian's second errand for her, so Vivian wouldn't have to leave her seat to do it.
There are people here who loved him, Daniel. People who were with him at the end. Don't make this about you.
I haven't said a word, I told her. I'm sitting in the back. That's the whole of what I'm doing.
Sitting in the back with a face like that is saying plenty. You've taken enough from this family. Let him be buried in peace.
What did I take? I said. Say it. What exactly do you think I took?
You know what you did. The whole family knows what you did. Don't sit here and play the wounded one. It's obscene.
You know what you did. The whole family knows. I looked at my aunt, my father's blood, my blood, a woman who'd held me as a baby in photographs I'd seen. And I understood that she fully believed every word. That was the cruelest piece of engineering in the whole thing. Vivian hadn't just lied to these people. She'd made them feel righteous repeating the lie. Marion wasn't doing a villain's work. In her own heart, she was defending her dead brother from the thief who'd come to his funeral to look sad. The fire didn't need fanning anymore. It had become the weather. I sat down. I didn't answer her because there was no answer that wouldn't become the scene Vivian wanted, and I'd promised the only person who mattered, a man against the wall I'd spoken to for 90 seconds on a phone, that I'd stay where I could see him. So I watched Marion walk back up to the second pew. I watched Vivian lean toward her and touch her arm in thanks, a small, graceful gesture, the kind a grieving widow makes, and I watched the room read it as two women comforting each other over the man they'd both loved. And here is the thing about Vivian I had finally let myself understand, sitting there. None of this was rage. People think a stepmother who erases a son must hate him, must have hated him since he was a boy. She didn't. I was never important enough to hate. I was a problem of arithmetic. She'd married late, married a man with a grown son and a house and a name that wasn't hers. And she'd done the math the way careful people do. And the math said that as long as I existed in that family with my father's blood in me and my initials under his porch, there was a door I could come back through that would put her son one chair further from the head of the table. So she'd closed the door, not in anger, in planning. The folder on the table 7 years ago wasn't the act of a woman who hated me. It was the act of a woman balancing a column. And I was the figure she needed to subtract before the total came due. I didn't have all of that yet. I had the shape of it, the cold draft of it through the house, the way you sense the open window without finding it. The full sum I wouldn't have until a dead man finished doing the arithmetic out loud. But I knew enough to keep my hands still and my eyes on Boyd. Then I did the thing I'd driven a state to do, which was nothing at all. I looked at Boyd. Boyd looked at the recorder under his hand, and down at the front of the chapel, in the seat with the card that bore his name and the word family, Grant Mercer rose, smoothed his tie, set the largest arrangement of flowers in the room under one arm, and walked toward the podium to tell 200 people who his father had really been. I want to tell you about the smallest thing I did all day, because the rest of it turned on it. I stayed in my seat. That was the whole act. A man hands you a printed sheet at the door of your father's funeral, tells the room you chose to leave, points you at the back row like a coat check, and the natural thing, the thing every part of you wants, is to stand up and walk out and let them have their clean church. I'd rehearsed it in the car. I had a whole exit planned. Then Boyd had caught my eye from the side door, once, the way you signal a man across a room without moving your face, and I'd understood that leaving was the one thing that would hand them the morning. So I stayed. I put the flowers face down on my lap, and I stayed. And while I stayed, I did the one thing a man with no plan and no lawyer of his own can do in a room that has already decided what he is. I held on to the paper. The sheet Vivian had pressed into my hand at the door. The family has asked that you not speak. I'd nearly let it fall on the steps outside. It was the kind of thing you crumple without thinking, the way you crumple a parking stub. But something in me, the part my father built before he sent the rest of me back, wouldn't let my fingers do it. I'd folded it once, along the crease it already had, and slid it into my breast pocket flat against the program. And I sat there in the back row with 2 pieces of paper over my heart, the order of service with his name on the front and the notice that I was not allowed to say it out loud. I didn't know yet that the second one mattered. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't being clever. I kept it the way you keep the receipt from the worst day of your life, because throwing it out felt like agreeing with it. Only later, when Calloway leaned across the pew and asked me, quiet, whether I still had what the widow had handed me at the door, did I understand that a thing written down and handed to a man in front of witnesses is not an insult. It's evidence. Vivian had spent 7 years being careful never to put her version of me on paper, and at the door, 3 minutes before her lawyer arrived, she'd put it on paper and pressed it into the one hand that would keep it. That's the only active thing I did. I didn't gather anything. I didn't catch anyone in a lie. I sat in a hard pew with my father's flowers turned face down on my knees, and I refused to throw away a single sheet of paper, and that turned out to be enough. Because other people had been gathering for a year, and all they needed from me was that I show up and not run. Calloway was the first of them to reach me. I'd noticed her before I knew her name. Second Pew from the front on the family side, which was the wrong side for a stranger and the wrong pew for a guest. A woman of about 60 in a gray suit with a slim leather folder squared on her knees, and her hands folded on top of it like a person who had timed something to the minute and was now simply waiting for the minute. She didn't look at the casket much. She looked at her watch and at the side door where Boyd came and went, and twice, early on, at me. When the Reverend stepped up to start, she rose without a sound and came down the side aisle against the flow of it, and sat herself in the empty stretch of my back pew like she'd been assigned the seat.
What hope do you have against me?
It wasn't a question. I turned my head. Do I know you? I said.
What hope do you have against me? No, your father did. I'm Ruth Calloway. I drew his will, the real one. I've been his lawyer for 19 years, and for the last of them I've been waiting in a pew exactly like this one, because he asked me to.
He asked you to come to his funeral.
What hope do you have against me? He asked me to come to this part of it. Not the prayers, this part. He was very specific about which part.
I looked at the folder on her knees. I didn't ask what was in it, and I want you to notice I didn't, because every instinct I had was screaming to grab it and open it right there in the back row and end the 7 years in 10 seconds. I didn't. I think some animal part of me already understood that a thing like that, opened in a corner by a bitter man nobody would believe, was worth nothing. It had to be opened where they'd all have to watch. Then why tell me? I said. If you've waited a year, you can wait through a funeral. Why lean across to a man in the back row now?
What hope do you have against me? Because in about 40 minutes a great deal is going to happen very fast. And your father did not want you blindsided in your own pew. He wanted you to know the shape of it before it started. Not the contents, the shape. May I?
Go ahead.
What hope do you have against me? There are two things that will happen after the eulogy, and only after the eulogy, because that was his condition. The first is Mr. Boyd's. He holds a standing instruction and an object I have not seen and am not permitted to see until it's played. The second is mine. I hold a sealed envelope I am not permitted to open until the recording finishes. I will tell you that both are dated. What hope do you have against me? I will tell you they're genuine, because I notarized the circumstances myself. I will not tell you what's in either one, because your father set the order, and I have spent 19 years learning not to improve on the man's order.
And the will. You said you drew the real one.
What hope do you have against me? I filed it for probate at 9 o'clock this morning, before the cars left for the church. It's downtown with a stamp on it and a case number, and it has been since before your stepmother put on her coat. What hope do you have against me? Whatever she filed 3 weeks ago, whatever she's been telling this room she is, the personal representative, the executor, what hope do you have against me? The one with the standing. There's a newer instrument in the system this morning, with my client's true signature on it. That part is already done. I only tell you so you'll understand. What hope do you have against me? Nothing that happens in this church changes the outcome. The outcome happened at a counter downtown 3 hours ago. What hope do you have against me changes you who has to sit and watch it land.
I sat with that. The same shape Boyd's phone call had 3 days before. The sense of something slow and official already turning while the family arranged flowers and rehearsed a story. I'd come to a funeral braced to be humiliated one more time, the last time, and a woman in a gray suit was telling me the humiliation was a formality the dead man had already overruled. 7 years ago, I said, because it was the only question I'd carried into the building, he stood up at the dinner table and said I wasn't his anymore. Where were you for that?
What hope do you have against me? I didn't know about it until 2 years after. He didn't come to me when it happened. Men don't, when they think they've caught a son betraying them. They don't call the lawyer, they call the family, and the family closes around the wound the way it's told to. By the time he found out what was really put in front of him that night, and who put it there, the table was 7 years cold and you were gone.
What was put in front of him?
What hope do you have against me? That's the recording's to tell, not mine. But I'll give you the part that's mine to give, because you've earned the warning. She turned the folder a 1/4 inch on her knees, squaring it again, the only restless thing about her. The night your father disowned you, somebody set a thing on the table that made a true son look like a thief. It was made to look like proof. It was made well. What hope do you have against me? And it was set there by the one person in this family who had the most to lose if you ever stopped being the villain.
Vivian.
What hope do you have against me? I didn't say a name, I said the person with them posters. You can do that arithmetic without me.
I could. I'd done a version of it 1,000 nights. But I'd always done it as a wronged man does it, looking for the moment the people he loved decided to believe the worst of him. I'd never once done it as a ledger. Who profited, what it cost them, what it bought. I started doing it that way now in the back pew, with the Reverend's voice going on up front about a man who'd built things with his hands. And the longer I did the arithmetic, the colder the answer got, because it stopped being about whether they believed me. It had never been about belief. Somebody had needed me gone, and had been willing to pay 7 years of family peace to keep me gone. And a stranger in a gray suit had just told me the payment was about to come due in front of the people who'd accepted it. 7 years of returned birthday gifts, sent back in the same boxes, never opened. If your father had done that to you, mailed back every package the day it arrived, unopened, for 7 straight years, would you have thrown them out the way they wanted you to, or would you have kept track of everyone? Tell me which kind of man you are. Calloway didn't stay long. She'd said her piece, given me the shape and not the contents, and she went back up the side aisle to her assigned pew and squared her folder on her knees and went back to watching her watch. But before she went, she said one more thing, low, half-turned.
What hope do you have against me? You still have what she handed you at the door.
It's in my pocket.
What hope do you have against me? Keep it there. That sheet is the first thing she's put in writing in 7 years. She was careful for 7 years. This morning she got careless at a church door because she thought the door was the end of you. Don't lose it before noon.
And that was the second time someone told me a piece of paper I'd nearly thrown away was the one I had to hold. I pressed my hand flat against my breast pocket, the program and the notice both, and I felt the crease of the folded sheet through the wool, and I kept my eyes forward like a man at a funeral, and I waited. It was Boyd who told me the scale of it. Not all at once. Boyd never did anything all at once. He came up the side during a hymn, when 200 people were on their feet with books open and nobody counts a man slipping into a back pew, and he sat at the far end of mine the way an undertaker sits, present and weightless, a man whose whole profession is being in the room without being in it.
Your father and I knew each other 40 years. I buried his first wife. I buried his mother. He picked out his own box from me 2 summers ago and paid for it in full, so nobody could argue about it later. That's the kind of man he was at the end. He wanted things settled so the living couldn't fight.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know a lot of him the last 7 years. That's not your doing. I want to say that to you before the rest of the morning, because the rest of the morning's going to be loud, and I won't get a quiet minute again. It wasn't your doing.
Then whose was it? He didn't answer that the way Calloway hadn't answered it. But he gave me the size of the thing, which was its own kind of answer.
3 weeks ago, the day after he passed, your stepmother came to my office to make the arrangements. Composed, organized. She had a folder of her own. Service order, the readings, who'd speak, who wouldn't. She handed me a printed list of who was family and who was not, for the seating. Your name was on the second list. She had it typed.
She typed it.
She typed it 3 weeks ago, and she handed it to me with her own hand, and I kept it, because I keep everything a family hands me. It's how I've stayed in business 40 years and never lost a lawsuit. People hand me things in grief that they'd deny in a courtroom, and I file every one. He let a beat of the hymn go by. She also told me there'd been a recent change to the estate. A new will, she said, drawn just before he passed. Everything to her son. She wanted me to know, she said, so I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Hale's lawyer made trouble. She was managing me, Daniel. 3 weeks ago, she was already managing the undertaker.
And the recording, the one Dad left you.
I've had it 11 months. He brought it to me himself in a sealed case with written instructions, and he made me read the instructions back to him out loud in my own office so there'd be no daylight in it later. 11 months it sat in my safe. 3 weeks ago, his widow stood in my office and managed me about a new will, and the whole time she talked. I had the answer to her in a box 40 feet away, and I said nothing, because it was not my turn. He set the turn, the eulogy, then the recording, then the envelope. In that order, no sooner. I've buried a lot of men. I never had one choreograph his own correction this carefully. He must have known exactly who he was dealing with.
I understood then that this had not been one cruelty 7 years ago. That was the version I'd lived inside, a single bad night, a father's single mistake, a wound with one date on it. What Boyd was laying out was a machine, 7 years of it, a typed list, a managed undertaker, a new will produced the day after the body was cold, a door at a church with a printed sheet ready. It hadn't been a moment of anger that erased me. It had been a project, maintained, renewed each birthday with a box sent back unopened, and the funeral was only the last load-bearing day of it, the day she sealed it, in front of the whole family, by handing the disowned son a piece of paper at the door. And the thing she didn't know, the thing none of them knew, was that the dead man had been building a wall against exactly this for 11 months, 40 feet from her, in an undertaker's safe, the whole time she was managing the undertaker. I sat with the size of it while the next hymn started and the room rose around me and I stayed seated, because the printed sheet said I wasn't to take part. I'd grieved this as a moment for 7 years, a folder I never saw, a verdict I never got to answer. But a moment doesn't need a typed seating list 3 weeks early, or a new will drawn the day after a man dies, or 7 birthday boxes carried back to a post office, one chosen trip at a time. That isn't anger. Anger burns out. This had been tended. Somebody had gotten up every year and fed it. And the cold part, the part that made me sit very still in that pew, was how cheap the disowning had been for her and how dear it had been for me. I lost a father, a name, 7 Christmases, the right to carry flowers up an aisle. She'd spent, what? An afternoon making a folder look found, a few minutes a year at a post office counter, a typed list. The arithmetic didn't balance, and I'd spent 7 years trying to make it balance, trying to find the size of crime I must have committed to be worth a punishment that large, when the truth was there'd been no crime on my side at all, only a folder on a table and a face Nora had never forgotten, and a woman who'd decided early that the cheapest thing she'd ever buy was getting rid of me. What I still couldn't see was why. I had the whole machine laid out. The folder, the disowning, the returned boxes, the typed list, the fast new will, the printed sheet at the door, and not one piece of it told me what she'd been so afraid of that she'd keep a fire lit for 7 years. I sat there in the rising hymn, understanding that the reason was the one thing nobody in the building would say out loud, and the one thing my father had recorded 11 months ago and sealed for after the eulogy, because he'd known, the way you know the load a wall is carrying, that it was the only part heavy enough to bring the whole thing down. Boyd rose when the hymn ended, the way an undertaker rises, and touched my shoulder once on the way past. Not the family's pat, the one I'd had on that same shoulder at the door from the aunt who'd nodded along with Vivian. A different weight entirely. Then he went back to his side door and his folded hands and his waiting, and the Reverend called the family forward for the eulogy, and I watched my stepmother's son stand up and button his jacket and walk to the front of the church carrying the largest spray of flowers in the building. I should tell you about the flowers now, because this is where they turned. I'd come with flowers. White roses, a dozen, bought that morning from the woman outside the chapel. The same white my father grew along the shop wall every summer until the last one, when his hands couldn't hold the shears, and he had Nora's children do the deadheading while he sat and told them which to cut. I'd picked them for that reason and no other. I'd carried them up the church steps, and Vivian had stopped me at the door and told me, along with the printed sheet, that the family would be laying the flowers, and that I should keep mine with me, keep them off the casket. So they'd been face down on my lap the whole service, the wrapping going soft and damp under my hands. And now, I watched Grant Mercer carry a spray 3 times the size of mine straight up the center aisle and lay it across the foot of the casket like a man laying claim to a house, and stand there a moment with his hand resting on the wood, letting 200 people see whose flowers were on the box and whose were turned face down in a back pew. Same object. My flowers and his, white on white, cut from the same idea of a grave. Opposite hands. He set his down where a sun sets them. Mine stayed in my lap where they'd been put. Then he straightened and he found me in the back row. He knew exactly where I was. They'd seated me there for the finding. And he held my eyes for a second longer than a grieving man needs to, and he turned to the room and began to speak.
My father was a builder. Some of you knew him from the shop. He used to say a house is only as honest as the man who frames it, and Dad framed his life square. He raised me to do the same.
Raised me. The first claim, dropped early and easy, the way you drop a thing you want a room to swallow without tasting.
I won't pretend our family was perfect. Every family has someone who walks away. Dad had room in his heart for a lot of people, but he had a hard line about loyalty, and when somebody crossed it, he closed the door and he didn't reopen it. I used to think that was hard of him. I understand it now. A man builds something with his own hands. He gets to decide who lives in it.
He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. 200 people did the looking for him, a slow turn of 200 heads toward the back pew, and I sat there with my father's flowers face down on my knees and let them look, because Calloway had told me the shape of the next 40 minutes, and I was holding 2 pieces of paper over my heart, and I was not going to stand up and give this room the bitter man they'd been promised.
So I'll say the thing nobody else will say at a funeral. I was Dad's only real son. Not by an accident of who showed up at the end. By the years, by the work, by every weekend in that shop and every hospital chair these last months, and every single thing a son is supposed to do, I did and I'd do it again. He knew it. He told me so. And I stand up here today as the only real son he had, to say goodbye for this family, because the others. And here, finally a small turn of his head, just enough, made their choice a long time ago, and the dead don't owe anything to the people who left them.
Only real son. He said it twice in one breath, the way you drive a nail you want to be sure of. And on the second one I saw Boyd, along the side wall, lay his hand flat on the little recorder. Not press it. Just rest his palm on it, the way you put a hand on a thing to keep it from going anywhere. He'd waited 11 months and 3 days and a whole eulogy, and he was waiting still, but his hand was on it now, and I understood that whatever was coming was tied to the exact words Grant had just put in the air, and that it was close. The room was very quiet. Somewhere up front, Vivian sat with her chin level and her gloved hands folded, and she did not turn to look at me, because she didn't need to either. She'd built this morning, and she was watching it stand. Only one person on the family side wasn't looking where she was supposed to. Down near the front, on the aisle, a young woman in dark blue had turned all the way around in her pew, and she wasn't looking at Grant. And she wasn't looking at the casket. She was looking at me. And she had a box on her lap. I didn't know yet that her name was Nora, that she was Vivian's daughter, that she'd been a teenager at that dinner table 7 years ago, and had spent the years since being introduced to people as proof that the family was whole without me. I only saw a young woman holding a box wrapped in paper gone pale and soft at the corners, the way paper goes when it's been kept somewhere safe for years, and looking at me like she was about to do a thing she'd decided on in the car and was now, watching her brother claim the only real son line out loud, fully sure of. She didn't come to me then, but while Grant was still talking, while the heads were turned, she did a thing I only understood later for the risk it was. She got up from the front pew, on the family side, in front of her mother, and she walked the long way around the back of the church and slid into the end of my pew the way Boyd and Calloway had, and she set the box on the wood of the bench between us. Up close, she was younger than she'd looked across the church, and her hands weren't steady on the box, and she spoke in the kind of low, fast voice a person uses when they've waited years to say a thing and are afraid of running out of nerve before they finish it.
I'm Nora. I'm her daughter. I have to tell you something before they play whatever they're going to play. Because if I don't say it now, I'll lose the nerve and go back to being the good one.
I didn't know what she meant by play. I didn't know yet that anyone but me had a sense of what Boyd had in his safe. I don't know you, I said.
You knew me when I was 16. I was at the table. I was sitting across from you the night Dad stood up and said you weren't his. I heard the whole thing, and I want you to know one true thing about that night, because nobody else in this room is ever going to tell it to you straight.
Then tell it. She looked at her mother's back for a second, at the leveled chin and the gloved hands up front, and then she looked at me, and she said it the way you confess a thing rather than explain it. Not a speech, not a lesson, a fact she'd carried.
There was a folder on the table that night. Mom put it there. She set it down in front of Dad before dessert, like it was an accident she'd just found it. And she said your name. And she said, "Look at this, Walter. Before you give that boy another dime." I was 16 and I didn't understand what was in it. I understood her face. People don't make that face about a thing they just found. They make it about a thing they made. I've thought about her face at that table every birthday for 7 years.
Why every birthday?
Because every birthday a box came back. His box to you, sent back unopened. And every birthday she handed it to me to put away, because she didn't want it in the house where Dad might change his mind looking at it. And I didn't throw a single one away. I want you to know that before anything happens up there, whatever they say about this family, somebody kept them.
I looked at the box between us on the bench. Soft-cornered, the paper gone pale, a year of dust ground faintly into the seams. There was a date on the tag in my father's hand, faded but there. I didn't reach for it. I asked her the only thing that mattered. Why now? Why you? You've been the good one 7 years. Why blow that up at his funeral in front of her?
Because last year he started sending me things, not boxes. A few minutes here and there when she wasn't home, and one of those times he told me he'd had a year to figure out who really put that folder on the table, and that he was fixing it before he died, and that he was sorry he was too proud to fix it sooner. He made me promise I'd be in this church today, and that I'd find you no matter where they sat you. He said you'd be in the back. He said she'd put you in the back. Her hands tightened on the edge of the bench. He was right about where you'd be. I just had to find the nerve to walk the long way around in front of her. That's all I did. I walked the long way around.
That was her whole confession, and there wasn't a lesson hung on it anywhere. She didn't tell me what family meant, or what her mother was, or what I was owed. She told me about a folder on a table, and a face she'd never forgotten, and 7 boxes she'd refused to throw out, and a promise she'd made a dying man to walk the long way around a church. Then she put her hand flat on the box, once, like she was making sure of it, and she slid back out of the pew and went the long way around again to the front, and sat back down beside her mother, and folded her hands, and became the good one again for the last few minutes she'd ever have to. Grant finished. He said something about peace, and a thing their father used to say about square corners, and he stepped back from the podium, and he did not return to his seat. He stood to the side of the casket, near the head of it, in the place a chief mourner stands, his big spray of flowers at the foot and his hand resting again on the wood, host of his father's death. And in the quiet after the eulogy, in the half-second where a reverend usually steps back up to close, nobody stepped up. Because this was the seam in the morning that my father had built 11 months before, the condition he'd made Boyd read back to him out loud. After the eulogy, not before, not a second before. I saw Boyd move from his side door, unhurried the way he did everything, an undertaker crossing his own floor. He went to a small table I hadn't paid attention to, set just below the foot of the casket beside the guest book and the framed photograph, and on that table, half hidden behind the flowers Grant had laid, was a thing I hadn't let myself look at directly all morning. A recorder. Old, square, the kind with a single speaker, the kind a man my father's age would trust, because it had buttons you could feel. Up front, Grant was still standing in the host's place with his hand on the wood, accepting the room's grief as his due. Vivian's chin was still level. Calloway, 3 pews from the front, had risen an inch in her seat, her folder no longer flat on her knees but upright in both hands. Nora sat beside her mother again, the good one, the soft-cornered box back on her own lap now where she'd carried it in, both hands flat on the lid. But her eyes were on me, across the whole length of the church, the way you watch the one person in a room who knows what you just did. And 200 people sat in the settled quiet of a funeral that they believed was nearly over, that they had no idea was about to begin. I want to tell you what that half-minute felt like, because it was the last half-minute of the only life I'd known for 7 years. The life where I was the bitter one, the one who left, the one whose flowers stayed in his lap. In a few seconds it would be a different morning and I'd be a different thing in this room. And I didn't know yet what, only that the man who'd carried it 11 months in a safe was crossing the floor to start it. I held very still. The flowers were soft in my hands now, the stems gone limp, white petals bruising where my grip had been. 3 pews up, a stranger in gray had a sealed envelope upright in both hands. Up front, a man stood with his palm flat on my father's casket, calling himself the only real son, and his mother sat beside her daughter with her chin level, watching the mourning she'd built stand exactly as she'd built it. None of them were looking at the small square box on the little table. They didn't know to. Only Boyd and Calloway and a young woman who'd kept 7 years of returned boxes, with the last one he never sent on her lap, knew that the order of the morning had one more item in it, and that the dead man had said it himself, and that it could not be argued with because the man who'd said it was lying in the box at the front of the church and past the reach of anyone who'd want to. Boyd reached the little table. He stood over the recorder a moment, the way you stand over a thing before you do the one irreversible part of a long job. He looked once at me in the back row, the same look he'd given me from the side door an hour before, the one that meant stay. Then he looked at the room, all of them, the widow and her only real son and the 200 who'd turned their heads, and he reached down with one steady hand toward the button on the front of the box. Grant sat down. The biggest bunch of lilies he'd carried up was already lying on the lid of the casket, white over the dark wood, exactly where a son puts flowers when he wants the room to see him do it. I had mine in my lap, face down, the way they'd been since the door. And then nobody moved, because there was a thing scheduled that none of them had scheduled, and the only person who knew the order of it was the gray-suited man standing by the side table with his hand already on a small black recorder. You should understand how a funeral wants to end. It wants the eulogy, then the hymn, then the slow file past the box, and the cars with their lights on in the daylight. It does not want a pause. Grant had handed it the ending it wanted, the eulogy claimed and signed off, the armful of lilies, the right amount of break in his voice. The Reverend had half risen to give the next cue. Everything in the room was leaning toward the door. 3 days before any of this, Arthur Boyd had called my phone. Not the house line where Vivian would have answered. Mine. He'd asked one question and then a second. The first was whether I'd be at the service. The second was whether I understood I might be the only one in that church who knew there was anything left to happen after the eulogy. I'd said yes to both, and he'd said good and hung up, because my father had left him a standing instruction in writing. Play the recording and open the one sealed envelope only after the eulogy, no sooner, no matter who objected. And a man like Boyd does not improve on a standing instruction. He executes it. He'd buried half the town. He knew what the dead are owed. Arthur Boyd did not look at Vivian. He had not looked at her once all morning. He looked at the room, and then he looked at me in the back row, the way a man looks when he is about to do the last favor he promised a friend he'd do. He didn't announce it. He didn't tap a glass. He said 6 words, flat, into a room that was already half standing.
Walter asked me to play something.
Then he pressed the key. For a second, there was only the hiss of a room recorded somewhere quieter than this one. You could hear a chair creak on the tape, far off, and a clock. Then my father's voice came out of that little speaker and filled St. Anne's the way it used to fill a kitchen, and every head in the front pews turned toward a box on a table because the man it belonged to was in a box of his own 4 feet away. I had not heard him speak in 7 years. What that does to a man isn't loud inside. It's a door you'd nailed shut, swinging open on a hinge that still works. The voice was his, exactly his, a little slower, and I sat in the back row of a church I'd been barred from speaking in, and I listened to my father say my name for the first time since he'd used it to throw me out. The recording opened with a date. He said it himself, plain, the way you'd date a check. Walter. This is Walter Hale. Today is the 11th of March, 2025. I'm recording this in Ruth Calloway's office, and she has the original. If you're hearing it, I'm in the ground and the eulogy is over, and Arthur kept his word. There was a pause on the tape. A breath taken in the middle of a sentence, slower than the man I grew up under. That breath was the only thing in the whole recording that told you the last year had cost him something, and I am not going to tell you more about it than that, because he didn't. Walter. 7 years ago, I stood up at my own dinner table and told my son Daniel he wasn't mine anymore. I had a folder in front of me that said he'd been stealing from me and lying to my face. The folder was put there. I know now who put it there. And I let them sell me the lie because it was easier than the truth. The son I sent away was the one I should have kept. The disowning was the one lie I let them sell me. Somebody in the third row said my father's name out loud, like a question. Vivian Hale sat very straight. She did not turn around to find me. She never once turned around. Not then, not after. Walter. There's a second thing on this tape, and it's the harder one, so I'll say it the way it is and not dress it up. Grant is not my son. He is not my blood. I had that confirmed years ago, and I kept my mouth shut, because he was a boy when his mother brought him into my house, and a boy doesn't get punished for what the grown people around him did. I would have carried that to the grave for him. I had decided to. What changed my mind is that the boy grew up and helped build the folder that took Daniel out of my will. He knew what he was, and he used what I didn't say to take what wasn't his, so I'm saying it now. The room had stopped pretending to be a funeral. Somebody near the front made a sound that wasn't a word, and my father, dated and recorded in a quieter room, kept going, because he'd left himself one more thing to say, and Boyd had been told to let it finish. Walter. I want the order of it on the record because the order is the whole thing. I found out about Grant 6 years before I made this tape. I sat on it. I sat on it on purpose, and I'd do that again, because the boy didn't choose his mother, and I'd raised him, and that was that. The reason I'm speaking is not that he isn't mine by blood. The reason I'm speaking is that he watched a folder get built to make my real son into a thief, and he carried the box that held it, and he let me believe it so the will would land on him. A man who'd do that to get what was never his. That man I'll name. The boy I'd have kept quiet for. The man I won't. That was the fact that turned the second twist from cruelty into something with a shape. The disowning was never about what I'd done, because I hadn't done it. Grant had never been my father's son by blood, and he had known it for years, and he had used the years of my father's mercy as a tool to pry me out of a will and slide himself in. The blood ran the other way from the names. The mercy ran the wrong direction entirely. Somewhere in the middle of that last part, Vivian had gotten to her feet and turned toward Boyd, and her hand had come up, not quite reaching, the way you reach for a radio dial in another man's car.
That's enough. Turn it off. This is private. This is not. Arthur, turn it off.
I can't do that, Mrs. Hale. He gave me an instruction in writing. Play it after the eulogy, all of it, no matter who asks me to stop. You're who he meant.
She sat back down. There wasn't anywhere else to go. The tape went quiet on its own a few seconds later. Boyd let it run a beat past the end, in case there was more, and there wasn't, and he pressed the key and the room was the room again, except it wasn't, and it was never going to be. They let me sit in the back while a man read a eulogy calling himself the only real son. When you find out which of them had the blood and which one knew the truth. What do you call the quiet one in the corner? I'll tell you what I did. Nothing. I kept my hands on the upside-down flowers in my lap, and I watched. Ruth Calloway stood up from the second pew on the left. She'd been there the whole service in a navy coat with a leather folder on her knees, and half the room had taken her for some cousin from out of state. She was not a cousin. She had been my father's lawyer for 19 years, and she had a sealed envelope she had not been allowed to open until this minute.
What hope do you have against me? My name is Ruth Calloway. I drew Walter Hale's will, and I held that recording in my office safe from the day he made it. I can confirm to everyone here that the voice is his, that the recording is dated and witnessed, and that nothing on it was added or cut. He gave me one more thing the same afternoon.
She held up the envelope so the room could see it was still sealed, the flap glued down, a strip of tape across it signed across the seam in my father's hand. She broke it open with her thumb in front of all of them. She did not read it to herself first. She read it out the way it came.
What hope do you have against me? 2 pages. The first is a laboratory paternity report dated the 9th of November, 2019. It states that the tested man, Walter James Hale, is excluded as the biological father of Grant Mercer. Excluded. Not unlikely. Excluded to a certainty. The second page is a signed acknowledgement in Walter's own hand, dated the same day as the recording.
She turned the second page to the room and read it the way it was written. His words, not hers.
What hope do you have against me? His own words. I learned in 2019 that Grant is not my son by blood. I told him myself that same year, the year I found it out. I chose to say nothing to anyone else. What hope do you have against me? And I would have kept that choice, except that Grant knew what he was, and used my silence to help take my son Daniel's name and inheritance from him. What hope do you have against me? I am setting it down so it cannot be unsaid after I'm gone. Daniel is my son, he always was. What hope do you have against me? The other was a kindness I let be turned into a weapon. He signs it Walter J. Hale, and the date's the same as the tape.
Mercer, not Hale. Half the room had heard the boy say his own name 1,000 times across 1,000 Thanksgivings and never once heard it. He'd carried his mother's name from before, and they'd all let it slide as paperwork. It was never paperwork. Grant was on his feet in the front pew. The color had gone out of him from the collar up.
That's not. You can't read private medical papers in a church. That's my father in that box. That's my father.
What hope do you have against me? He's not. You've known he's not since the year he found out himself, and you were shown that page. There's a line on the acknowledgement about that, too. He writes that he sat you down in 2019. What hope do you have against me? The year he learned it and told you, because he didn't want you finding out from a stranger after he was gone. You've had 6 years with this, Grant. What hope do you have against me? You stood up here 10 minutes ago and called yourself the only real one.
She's lying. She worked for him for years. She'd say anything he wanted.
What hope do you have against me? I'd say the truth, and the lab will say it again under subpoena, and it'll say the same thing it said in 2019. You can hire your own lab. I'd encourage it. The number won't move.
He loved me. Whatever's on that paper, he loved me. He raised me. That counts for.
What hope do you have against me? It does. He says so on the tape. He'd have taken the secret to the grave for the boy. He says that too. What it doesn't cover is the folder. You don't get to keep the love and the folder both. He picked one. You picked the other, a long time ago, and you signed your name to it.
Vivian Hale stood then. Not fast. She rose the way she'd risen at the church door an hour earlier, when she'd put a printed sheet in my hands and told the room I'd chosen to leave them. She had a voice built for rooms. She used it.
This is grief. This is a grieving family being made into a spectacle by a man who was thrown out of it for cause. Daniel, you should be ashamed. Walter cut you off himself, with his own hands, at his own table. We all watched him do it.
I didn't answer her. Calloway did, and she didn't raise her voice, which was worse for Vivian than if she had.
What hope do you have against me? He cut Daniel off because of a folder, Vivian. A folder of bank records and a letter that put Daniel at meetings Daniel was never at. I deposed the bank in April. The records were altered. The account Daniel supposedly drained was opened after the date he supposedly drained it. You opened it. Your name's on the signature card. What hope do you have against me? You built the thing that emptied this family of its son, and then you walked the real son in here today carrying lilies. I never touched a bank account in that man's name. What hope do you have against me? The branch in Millbrook has your driver's license on file with the application. The teller remembers you. I have her statement. The account was opened the 4th of June. The folder claims Daniel drained it in May. You're a careful woman, Vivian. You were careful about almost everything. You weren't careful about which month came first.
That was the first time I heard it laid out flat, the whole 7 years of it, in 19 seconds, by someone who wasn't me. 7 years before, Vivian was the one who set the false evidence on my father's desk and let him believe I'd robbed him. That's what kicked the disowning loose. And after he died, she'd filed the new will with the court, the one that left it all to Grant, and signed herself in as the person who'd run the estate. I knew the shape of it the way you know a bruise under a sleeve. Now the room knew it, in dates, with a teller's name attached. Vivian's late marriage was the whole engine of it, and you only saw the engine here at the end, in a church, when it was too late to be private. She'd married my father at 49. She'd come in afraid of being a second wife in another woman's house, with a son who wasn't his, and she'd done the math on what happens to a woman like that when the husband dies and the blood son is standing there. She didn't hate me. I think that's the part people want and don't get. There was no scene where she said she hated me. She just looked at a future where I'd be in the house and her boy would be out of it, and she rearranged the past until that future couldn't happen. So she'd erase the blood son first, years ahead, while she still could. And she'd never once guessed that the man she was protecting her boy's inheritance from already knew her boy wasn't his. She did the thing she always did when a room got away from her. She made it about feeling instead of fact.
You're standing in a church over my husband, doing this to his memory. Every person here knew Walter. They knew he made his own decisions. Are you all going to sit here and let a lawyer and a discarded son rewrite the man you buried? What hope do you have against me? He rewrote it himself, Vivian. That was his voice. You heard it. I just brought the paper that agrees with him.
She tried one more time. I'll give her that.
A recording can be edited. A grieving old man can be coached into saying, "What hope do you have against me?" Then you'll want to take that up with the court because I'm filing the real will this afternoon. The notarized one, the recorded one, the one that predates the will you submitted to probate by 2 years.
The doors at the back of the chapel opened. I felt the draft before I heard the footsteps. A man in a plain jacket came up the side aisle, unhurried, the way they teach you to walk when you do that for a living, and he stopped at the rail in front of the altar, the rail where Vivian had stood at the door of the room and decided who got to grieve and who didn't. And he held out a folded sheaf to her by name. Server. Vivian Hale? She took it because your hand takes a thing before your head decides not to. He told her she'd been served. He told her there was a petition to remove her as personal representative of the estate of Walter Hale and a referral to the district attorney's office regarding the altered bank records, the will submitted to probate, and a document she'd circulated as my father's disownment of me. He used the word forgery. He used the word fraud. He said both quietly, at the altar, in front of every person she'd ever performed her marriage for. And then he left the way he came. Vivian held the papers and looked for the first time all morning, like a woman in a room she didn't control. She found one thing to say, and she aimed it at Calloway, low, the way you say a thing you don't want carrying.
You planned this. You sat in my husband's funeral all morning, with this in your coat, and you let me read the eulogy off like it was a normal day. What hope do you have against me? I sat in your husband's funeral because your husband asked me to. The timing isn't mine, Vivian. He set it. After the eulogy, he said. Not before. He wanted you to have the mourning.
I think that landed harder than the petition did. He'd let her have the mourning on purpose, let her bar me at the door and read her version into the room and feel for 1 hour like the house was hers, and then took the hour back with his own voice from a table. A man doesn't design a mourning like that out of nowhere. He designs it after he's worked out exactly how much of it she stole and decided she could keep the parts that didn't matter. I will tell you the part that mattered to me. and it is small. Aunt Marion, who'd spent 7 years telling the family I was just a bitter man, sore about money, who'd stood at the church door an hour ago and nodded along while Vivian read me out of my own father's funeral. Aunt Marion leaned over to the woman next to her and said the only thing she said all day.
I only ever knew what Vivian told me.
That's all the spine she had. It was enough to tell you where the smear had come from and who'd carried water for it without checking the well. The only voices left raised were the two that had built the thing together, and by then they weren't aimed at me. They were aimed at each other. Grant had crossed the front of the chapel to where his mother stood holding the server's papers, and whatever was between them came out in the open because there was no private left in that room.
You told me he never knew. You told me, you swore to me, that he never found out. You let me get up there and say it, in front of everyone.
Keep your voice down.
You knew there was a tape?
I didn't know what was on it. Lower your voice.
It doesn't matter now how loud I am, does it? You did this. You built the whole thing and you handed me a eulogy and you sent me up there blind.
She didn't answer him. That was the answer. The two of them had spent 7 years on the same side of a folder, and it took my father about 4 minutes from the grave to put them on opposite sides of it. I didn't enjoy it the way I'd thought I would. I'd imagined that moment for years and built it bigger in my head than it was. In the room, it was just two people finding out at the same time that the only thing holding them together had been a lie that was now public, and there's nothing in that worth standing closer to watch. The probate part was not loud. None of the real part was loud, and that surprised me because I'd spent 7 years imagining it loud. In my head, it had always had shouting in it, and a gavel, and Vivian dragged out of something. It wasn't like that. It was a courtroom the size of a classroom on a Tuesday, and a judge who'd read the file, and Calloway sliding a folder across a clerk's desk. Calloway laid 2 wills on the counter in front of the judge, side by side, and turned them both to face the bench. She set one finger on the first.
What hope do you have against me? This is the instrument Mrs. Hale submitted 3 weeks ago. Read the date. It's drawn the week after he died.
She slid the second one a 1/2 inch forward so it sat square against the first.
What hope do you have against me? This is the one I filed the afternoon of the funeral. Notarized, recorded. Read its date. It's 2 years older, signed while he was alive and well and trusted the people at his table. Same man. 2 papers. One of them showed up the week of the burial. The court only has to ask which came first.
That date did all the work. The judge read the file, read the 2 dates, and took the older paper over the convenient one, the way courts do. Vivian was off the estate inside the month. Removed as personal representative before she'd moved $1 of it anywhere, a neutral administrator put in over her objection that the judge noted and overruled in 1 sentence. The disownment letter and the will she'd submitted went to the district attorney as exhibits, not theories. The bank's deposition stapled behind them. And Grant had already left the church before the service was technically over, walking fast down the side aisle with nobody beside him, into something that wasn't an inheritance. It was a question with his name on it, asked by people who didn't care that he used to ride on the back of my bike. Here is the part I didn't expect, and the part I keep coming back to. The estate came back to me. The blood son. The real one. The one whose name was on the tape. The house. The land behind it. All of it. By a will my father wrote with his own hand while he still trusted me, then was talked out of, then wrote back to me in a recording when he couldn't be talked out of anything anymore. They offered me a clean way to take it, too. Nobody tells you about this part because it isn't dramatic. The estate's own lawyer, not Calloway, a man the court appointed once Vivian was off, sat across a desk from me a week later and laid it out like a kindness, because to him, it was one. Lawyer. You're in a strong position, Mr. Hale. You don't need the criminal piece. The will's clean, the house is yours, the probate's effectively decided. The referral to the DA is a separate track, and frankly, it's the messy one. A forgery case means depositions. It means your stepmother's photograph in the county file. It means this drags out 2 more years and you reading about your own family in the paper. You're the only complaining party left in the family. If you let it sit, it lapses. You'd be within your rights to want it over. A clean way out, the house without the trial, the money without the photograph in the file. I sat with it for about 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than I needed. Keep the referral open, lawyer. You understand you'd be choosing the harder road for no financial gain. I understand it. And then Grant came back, because of course he did. He waited by my car in the funeral home lot 3 days after that, hands open, the way Vivian held her hands when she lied.
You don't have to do this. Drop the referral. You've already got the house. You've got everything. What does it cost you to let the rest go?
It costs me the 7 years, that's what it costs.
We were kids together, Daniel. I used to ride on the back of your bike. Whatever I did, whatever you think I did, we were brothers once.
We were never brothers. You knew that before I did. You sat at that table when he read me out, and you knew the one thing in the room that would have fixed it. And you said nothing, because nothing was worth a house to you. So no, I keep the referral. He didn't have anything for that. He stood by my car a second longer, and then he went, and I drove home. And I told the estate's lawyer the next morning that the answer hadn't changed. I didn't keep the house either, not the way he meant. There was one bill in the file the fake will would have left unpaid, and I cleared that before I touched anything else. I'll come back to it. The house I lived in for a season and then could not stand the quiet of, so I sold it, and the land behind it with it. The money, all of it, after the one bill, I signed into a fund for the kids in the family to go to school on. All of them. Including Nora's too, who never asked me for a thing and were never going to be made to choose a side by me. Somebody always thinks there's an angle. There wasn't an angle. I didn't want to wake up rich off the same estate they'd tried to frame me out of. The money didn't pile up anywhere I could touch it. It went out the door faster than it came in, which is the only way I could look at it. That left the casket, and it left Nora. Nora is Vivian's daughter, Grant's sister, which makes her, by the only math that ever mattered to my father, the stepsister who was never anything to me on paper and turned out to be the one person in that family who'd kept faith. She didn't build the folder. She didn't carry the smear. She'd sat in the second row through all of it with a shopping bag at her feet that nobody had looked at twice. And when the room finally emptied, when Vivian had gone out the side door with a sheaf of legal paper in her fist, and Grant was already in the parking lot and the Reverend was gathering his book, Nora stood up, picked up the bag, and walked over to the back row where I was still sitting with my flowers face down in my lap.
He sent these back every year. 7 of them. Mom told you he threw them out. He didn't throw them out. He sent them back unopened, and I took them out of the return pile before they went anywhere. And I kept them. All 7. I didn't know what else to do with them, so I kept them.
Why didn't you ever say anything?
Because I was a coward, Daniel. And because she's my mother. And because every year I told myself he'd come around and ask for your number and I wouldn't have to. He never did. And then he was sick, and then he was gone. So I'm saying it now. That's the most I've got.
It was more than most of them ever gave. She didn't ask me to forgive her, and she didn't tell me she'd known better all along. She just said what she'd done and what she hadn't, which is the only kind of confession I've ever believed. The part of me that had spent 7 years sorting the family into the ones who'd lied and the ones who'd nodded along, that part didn't have a slot for her. She wasn't either one. She was the one who'd kept the boxes. She held out her hand. Not the bag. Her hand. And she walked me up the center aisle to the front of the chapel, to the casket, to the exact spot on the left side where Grant had stood an hour earlier to lay down the biggest flowers in the room and call himself the only real son. She put me where he'd stood. Then she reached into the bag and took out a box. And she said there was one more I needed, one I'd never seen, because he'd wrapped this one to send to me and died before he could mail it. It was a birthday box, old paper, a kind they don't sell anymore. the corners soft from a long wait in a closet, the ribbon flattened where other boxes had lain on top of it. My name on the tag in my father's writing. He'd wrapped it himself, the way he always wrapped, too much tape, a bow that gave up halfway. It wasn't one of the 7 I'd mailed him. This was the one he never sent. Nora set it in my 2 hands. I want to tell you about the boxes, because they're the part nobody outside the family ever understood. For 7 years, I'd mailed him one thing on his birthday, every birthday, without missing a single one. Small things. A book. A photograph of a bridge we'd driven over once when I was a kid, because he'd liked the bridge. 7 of them, 1 a year, and everyone came back. Same box, retaped, my own handwriting on the front with a second line under it in a stranger's pen. Return to sender. Vivian had said as much through a cousin once. He doesn't want them, Daniel, throwing them out the day they land. So I'd believed they were going in the trash the moment they reached the house. They weren't. The whole time, all 7 of them, Nora had been pulling mine out of the return pile before they ever went back to me and keeping them in a closet, because she couldn't throw them out and couldn't give them to me without a war. His daughter walked me up to the casket and put the flowers back in my hands. Would you have laid them down, or would you have walked out of that church for good? I opened it. There's no clean way to open a box your dead father wrapped and never sent, so I just opened it. Inside was a pocket knife, bone handle, worn smooth on one side, the one he'd carried my whole childhood and I'd asked him for once when I was 9, and he'd said when you're older. He'd never given it to me. He'd kept saying when you're older, year after year, until older arrived and we weren't speaking. And here it was, in the last box, the one he never sent, packed in the last year of his life. So at some point near the end, after he'd worked out who'd really put the folder on the table, my father had taken the knife off his own belt, wrapped it, and decided this was the birthday I was finally old enough. He'd addressed it to me and set it aside to mail, and then the year ran out before he could. The gift and the long overdue truth both waiting in the same closet for a son who wasn't there yet. Under the knife, folded once, a card. The writing on it ran a little uneven near the end of the lines, the way a hand goes when the year has been long, and I'm only going to tell you that much about the hand. It said, "Happy birthday, son. You were always older than I gave you credit for. Come home." It was dated his last year. He'd written "come home" and then died before he could send it. He'd wanted me back and run out of time to put a stamp on it. I stood where Grant had stood. I had the knife in one hand and the card in the other, and the flowers. The flowers Vivian had told me to keep off the casket at the door, the flowers that had ridden face down in my lap through the whole service, were still in the crook of my arm. They sent the gifts back unopened, every year, and they told me to keep the flowers off the casket. The flowers are on the casket now. The last box, the one he never sent, is open in my hands. I laid them down. White over dark wood next to the spot Grant's lilies had been before someone quietly carried his out with the trash. Mine were not the grandest in the room. They never had been. They were a dozen white roses I'd bought that morning off the woman selling flowers outside the chapel, wrapped in brown paper and cheap twine, because they were the last thing I could still hand a man who wasn't taking my calls. They'd ridden face down in my lap the whole service, the same lap they'd ridden the last hour of a 400-mile drive, while a man who wasn't my father's son called himself the only one who was. First flowers I'd put on anything of my father's in 7 years. I straightened them once, the way you do, and stepped back. I didn't say anything over him. There wasn't a thing to say that the tape hadn't already said in his own voice, and I wasn't going to stand at his box and improve on it. People want a son to lean over the casket and whisper something. I didn't have a whisper. I had a man's own dated voice still ringing off the stone behind me, naming me, calling me home a year too late and 7 years too late, and exactly on time all at once. That was the conversation. I'd had it. I let it be the last one. Nora stood beside me with the empty bag. Not her mother's daughter right then. Just somebody who'd kept 8 boxes in a closet. the 7 they'd sent back and the one he never got to send, because throwing them out felt like agreeing with a lie. She didn't take my arm, and she didn't cry on me. She just stood there at the rail until I was done standing there, and then we walked out together, past the pew where her mother had been sitting, out the same door Vivian had used to keep me out, and nobody stopped either one of us. I don't talk to Vivian. The case is the case. It'll do what cases do. And I'll show up when they tell me to and say what's true and not one word past it. I don't talk to Grant. He calls, sometimes, from numbers I don't know, and I don't pick up. And that's not me forgiving him, and it's not me hating him. It's just me not picking up. Forgiving a man and sitting down to dinner with him are two different rooms, and I only ever found the door to one of them. The one bill I paid off myself, first, before anything else, the single line of paper with his name on it and a hospice's name across the top from his last year, I paid in cash from the estate the same week the court handed it to me, so it wouldn't sit in a file with his name attached to a debt. I never went to the place. I don't know the room, that's on purpose. He didn't choose how that last year went, and I wasn't going to spend his money walking through the worst of it just to see it. I just paid the line and closed it. The knife is in the drawer by my bed. I carry it some days and not others. It depends on the day. The card is in the box, and the box is on the shelf where I can see it, opened now, the way it should have been the year he wrapped it. The other 7 boxes Nora kept are up there next to it, still wrapped, and I haven't opened those, and I don't know if I will. All of them I already know what's inside because I'm the one who mailed them. Nora's 2 kids start school in the fall on my father's money, and they don't know whose money it is, and they don't know there was a tape or a folder or a church, and I'd like to keep it that way. Let them think school is just school. He waited until his own funeral to get the last word. He got it. The room heard the name, and the name was Daniel, and I'm the son he buried twice, and then, on a dated tape from a quieter room than that church, dug back up with his own voice. Until next time.